A glass case sat empty on the farmhouse mantel, dust ringing the spot where 7 medals once gleamed. Outside, 100 small voices squealed through the dark. An old man in muddy boots carried a lantern across the yard, breath fogging, and pushed open the barn door. Why would a decorated veteran trade the proudest thing he owned for animals nobody wanted? The answer began months earlier. Spring had not yet softened the hills when Eli Mercer leaned on his fence, watching a neighbor's truck rattle past. His granddaughter, visiting for the weekend, asked why he kept the medals hidden in a box instead of on display. Eli was quiet a moment. "A medal just tells you what a man did once," he said. "It doesn't tell you what he's worth now. Worth is what you do when nobody's clapping." She frowned, not understanding. In time, the whole county would. Eli Mercer had lived on the same 40 acres for 31 years, ever since he came home and decided he wanted nothing louder than wind in the grass. His farm was modest by any measure. A leaning barn he patched each autumn, a vegetable patch, a dozen laying hens, and an old blue pickup that started on the second try if he was patient with it. He kept to himself, not out of bitterness, but out of a deep contentment that confused people who needed more. His mornings followed a rhythm worn smooth by repetition. Coffee at 5, hens fed by 5:30. Fences checked, tools sharpened, the small, endless work of a place that asked little and gave back just enough. He was 72, lean as a fence rail, with hands that had learned to mend nearly anything. Folks in the town of Harlan Crossing knew him as the quiet farmer on Route 9. They tipped their hats at the feed store and left him to his business. Few knew about the box. It lived in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser, wrapped in a faded handkerchief. Inside were 7 missals from a chapter of his life he rarely spoke about. Years spent overseas doing hard work he believed in, alongside men he had loved like brothers. He had come home, some of them had not. The medals, to Eli, were less an honor than a weight, a reminder of a debt he could never quite name or repay. His wife, Margaret, had passed 4 winters ago. Since then, the house had grown quieter still, and Eli had filled the silence with chores and the company of his dog, a graying border collie named Scout, who followed him everywhere on 3 good legs and 1 stiff one. Money was tight but steady. A small pension, a little from selling eggs, and the occasional repair job for neighbors. He owed nothing and owned little, and he had made a kind of peace with the smallness of it all. He told himself he wanted nothing more. But there was a restlessness in him lately that he could not explain, a sense, in the long evenings, that he had been coasting, that a man could be too careful with what was left of his life. He felt it most at dusk, sitting on the porch with Scout's head on his knee, watching the light fade and wondering, quietly, whether he still had something left to give. The county livestock auction came twice a year, and Eli went mostly out of habit and to see familiar faces. He had no plans to buy. He stood near the back of the noisy barn, hands in his pockets, half listening to the auctioneer's rattle, when a side gate clattered open. 100 piglets poured into the holding pen, small, pink, trembling things, jostling and squealing. They had come from a farm that had folded suddenly, and they were thin, some limping, all of them frightened. The auctioneer tried to sell them as a lot. No hands went up. He split them smaller, still nothing. "Folks, these'll need feeding through a long winter," the auctioneer called. "Nobody?" Then they go to the cull buyer at the gate. Eli felt something tighten in his chest. He looked at those small, shaking bodies pressed together for warmth, and he could not look away. The cull buyer was a heavy-set man leaning against the far rail, already reaching for his clipboard. Eli understood what that meant. These piglets, too many and too weak, would not be raised. They'd simply be taken off the books, removed, gone. 100 small lives erased because no one wanted to gamble on them. Eli's mind ran the numbers before his heart could interrupt. 100 pigs through a winter meant feed, sacks and sacks of it, week after week. It meant a bigger pen, more fencing, medicine for the sick ones, water hauled in the cold. It meant work that would break a younger man's back, let alone a man of 72. He had a small pension and a thin cushion of savings. The math did not work. It did not come close to working. He told himself to walk away. He was an old man with one good dog and a leaning barn. He had no business taking on 100 mouths. Margaret would have put a hand on his arm and said gently that he couldn't save everything, that this wasn't his to carry. But Margaret would also have been the first one through that gate. He thought about his own evenings on the porch, the restlessness, the question that had been gnawing at him, whether he still had anything left to give. He looked at the piglets again. One small runt had wedged itself into the corner, pushed out by the others, shaking so hard its whole body trembled. It lifted its head and seemed, impossibly, to look right at him. Eli looked away. He stared at the rafters. He counted his breaths. He thought about every practical reason a sensible man would have to keep his hands in his pockets and let the world do what the world always did. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Going once then to the gate, Eli's heart was loud now, drowning out the arithmetic. He thought of the box in his dresser drawer. 7 medals that did nothing but gather dust and remind him of a debt. Worth is what you do when nobody's clapping. The words came to him in his own voice, surprising him. What good was honor sitting in a drawer? What good was a careful, quiet life that risked nothing, gave nothing, changed nothing? His hand began to rise before he had fully decided. Around him, the murmur of the crowd dropped away. He felt the eyes of his neighbors turn toward the strange sight of old Eli Mercer, the man who never bought anything, lifting his weathered hand into the air. "I'll take them," he said, "all of them." The barn went quiet, then rippled with disbelief. The auctioneer lowered his gavel slowly, certain he had misheard. "Ellie, that's 100 head." "You sure?" "I'm sure." A few people laughed, thinking it a joke. When they realized he meant it, the laughter faded into uneasy glances. Someone muttered that the old man had finally lost his footing. Eli barely heard them. He arranged to leave a deposit and bring the rest in 2 days' time, then walked out into the gray afternoon with his heart pounding and no real idea how he would pay. He only knew the piglets would not go to the gate. As he climbed into his pickup, Scout's tail thumping in the passenger's seat, Ely understood his quiet life had just ended. The next morning, a girl appeared at his fence. She was maybe 16, with a serious face and a bicycle she let drop in the grass. Her name was June Avery, and she'd been at the auction with her father. "I heard what you did," she said. "I want to help. I'm good with animals. I'll work for free." Eli started to refuse. He worked alone. He always had. But there was something in her stubborn jaw that reminded him of someone, maybe himself, long ago. "It's hard work," he warned. "Cold and dirty and no thanks in it." June picked her bike back up and grinned. "Good." The problem of money came first, and Eli did not let himself think about it too long, because he knew that thinking would only talk him out of what he had already decided in his bones. He drove into Harlan Crossing the next afternoon and parked outside Delaney's, the antique and consignment shop on the corner of Main. He sat in the truck for a full 10 minutes, with the box on his lap, the faded handkerchief soft under his fingers. Then he unwrapped it. 7 medals lay against the cloth, dull with age but unmistakable for what they were. He had not looked at them in years. He made himself look now. He thought of the men those medals were tangled up with, their faces, their voices, the things they'd carried for each other. He had always believed the medals belonged to them as much as to him. And it occurred to him, sitting there in the cab of his truck, that those men had never once turned away from someone who needed them. Not ever. That was the whole point of them. He wrapped the medals back up, went inside, and set them on the counter. Mr. Delaney was a careful, soft-spoken man who knew value when he saw it. He examined the medals under a lamp for a long while, then looked up over his glasses. "Ely, these are significant. Collectors pay real money for genuine pieces like these, with documentation. You could get a good deal for them." He paused. "But are you certain? Once they're gone, they're gone. You don't sell something like this to make a truck payment." "It's not for a truck," Eli said. "It's for feed." Delaney waited for more, and when none came, he simply nodded the way decent men nod when they sense a thing is bigger than they understand. He named a figure. It was more than Eli expected, enough for fencing, feed, and a margin to get through the worst of winter if he was frugal. Eli signed the paper, took the envelope, and walked out lighter in his pocket, but lighter somehow in his chest, too. The Piglets arrived the following morning in a borrowed stock trailer that Eli's nearest neighbor, a gruff cattleman named Walt Pruitt, had agreed to lend, even though it's the dumbest thing I ever heard. 100 piglets, it turned out, made a tremendous amount of noise and an even more tremendous amount of mess. They spilled out into the hastily reinforced corral beside the barn in a pink, squealing flood, and within the first hour, Eli understood the true scale of what he had taken on. They were everywhere. They rooted under the bottom rail and squeezed through a gap he'd have sworn a cat couldn't fit through. 3 of them got into Margaret's old flower bed before he'd finished unloading the feed. One climbed clean into the water trough and had to be fished out, indignant and dripping. Scout ran in circles, overwhelmed by the impossibility of herding 100 animals that had no interest whatsoever in being herded. June arrived on her bicycle at 7 sharp and took in the chaos with wide eyes, then rolled up her sleeves without a word. The first lesson was fencing. Eli and June spent 2 days driving posts and stringing hog wire low to the ground, and every time they finished a section, a piglet found a new weakness in the old. It became a kind of contest. Eli would patch a gap. An hour later, he'd count heads and come up short and find the escapee happily rooting in the garden, looking pleased with itself. He named that one Houdini against his own better judgment because he had told himself firmly that he would not be naming 100 pigs. The feeding was its own education. He'd raised a hog or two in his life, but 100 was a different animal entirely. They had to be fed on a schedule. The weak ones separated so the strong wouldn't crowd them out. June turned out to have a real gift for it. She could spot a sickly piglet from across the pen, could tell which ones weren't eating, which ones were favoring a leg. She'd grown up reading every animal book the small library had, and she'd been waiting, Eli realized, her whole young life for exactly this. By the end of the first week, Eli was sore, in places he'd forgotten he had. His savings were already thinner than he'd planned, and the corral smelled like 100 pigs. But standing at the fence in the evening light, watching the little herd settle into the straw, he felt something he hadn't felt in 4 long years. He felt useful. He felt against all sense happy. Word traveled through Harlan Crossing the way it always did. Over coffee at the diner, across pickup beds at the feed store, in the slow, careful gossip of a small place where everyone knew everyone. The story that spread was not a kind one. Old Eli Mercer sold his war medals. People could hardly believe it, and when they confirmed it was true, they didn't know what to make of him. Some shook their heads at the waste of it. A man's medals were sacred, weren't they? You didn't trade something like that for livestock. A few decided he must be slipping, that grief over Margaret had finally caught up with him, and they said so in lowered voices that still somehow reached his ears. Walt Pruitt came by on the 10th day and leaned on the fence, chewing a toothpick, watching the piglets with open skepticism. "You know what these'll cost you to carry through to spring," he said. "More than you'll ever get back. You'd have done better letting them go. Kinder even than letting them starve when your money runs dry." "They won't starve," Eli said. "You don't know that," Walt spat into the dirt. "I've farmed 40 years. You can't save everything that's drowning, Eli. You'll go under trying." He wasn't being cruel. That was the worst of it. He meant it as kindness, the hard, practical kindness of a man who'd watched soft hearts ruin good farms. Eli didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that you don't win an argument by talking. You win it by being right, later, in a way that can't be denied. The truth was, Walt's words sat heavy in him because part of him feared they were correct. The feed bills were already mounting faster than he'd calculated. 100 growing pigs ate an astonishing amount, and they grew fast, which meant they ate more each week than the week before. He found himself doing arithmetic at the kitchen table late at night, the numbers refusing to balance no matter how he arranged them. Then came the sickness. It started with the runt, the small that had looked at him across the auction pen, the one June had quietly named Pip and slipped extra food. Pip stopped eating. Then two others went off their feed, then four. They lay listless in the straw, refusing to get up, and Eli felt a cold dread he recognized from a different life. He and June worked through the night. June had read about it, a respiratory ailment that swept through young pigs in cold, damp conditions. They moved the sick ones into the barn where it was warmer and drier, bedded them deep in clean straw, and called the county vet doctor. Sandoval, who came out at dawn and confirmed June's diagnosis with a raised eyebrow at the girl's knowledge. The medicine cost money Eli didn't really have. He paid it anyway. For 3 days and nights, he and June took shifts in the barn, dosing the sick piglets, coaxing them to drink, keeping them warm. Eli held the smallest ones against his chest under his coat the way he'd once held. Well, the way he'd once done other things he didn't talk about. Scout lay in the barn doorway the whole time, refusing to leave, as if he understood his job had changed. On the fourth morning, Pip stood up. The little runt wobbled to his feet, shook himself, and trotted over to the feed trough as if nothing had happened. June laughed and cried at the same time, and Eli had to turn away and busy himself with a bucket so she wouldn't see his face. They lost none of them. Every single piglet pulled through, Doctor. Sandoval, packing up her bag, told Eli plainly that she'd treated outbreaks like this on big operations that lost a third of their stock. "Whatever you two did," she said, "you did it right." After that, something shifted on the little farm. The piglets, fed and warm and growing, transformed before Eli's eyes. Their ribs disappeared under healthy weight. Their coats grew sleek, the limping ones healed. They developed personalities. Houdini the escape artist, Pip the runt, who followed Eli like a second dog, a fat, contented one June called Sergeant who always ate first and slept the most. Eli gave up pretending he wasn't naming them. The work never stopped, and the money kept draining, but the farm had come alive in a way it hadn't been since Margaret. Mornings were loud now, full of grunts and squeals, and the patter of 100 small feet at feeding time. June showed up every day, rain or shine, and Eli found himself looking forward to the sound of her bicycle on the gravel. The two of them, the old man and the girl, had built something out of nothing but stubbornness and care. But the deeper into autumn they went, the thinner the envelope from Delaney's grew. The turning point came on a bright October Saturday. June's father, a quiet man named Carl Avery, who ran the diner, drove out to see what had so consumed his daughter's every waking hour. He stood at the fence for a long time, watching the healthy, thriving herd, watching Eli move among them, watching his own daughter work with a confidence and joy he'd never seen in her at home. "I owe you an apology," Carl said finally. "Folks have been saying you went soft in the head. I've been hearing it for weeks." He shook his head slowly. "This isn't a soft man's work." Eli wiped his hands on a rag. "She's the one with the gift," he said, nodding at June. "I just had the empty barn." Carl smiled. "Maybe, but you filled it." For all the warmth of that October afternoon, the truth Eli had been out running finally caught up with him as the weather turned. The cold came early and hard that year. The first real freeze hit in the second week of November, and with it came every expense Eli had quietly hoped to avoid. The water lines froze and had to be wrapped and heated. The barn needed more insulation than its old walls offered, so he bought lumber and straw and a propane heater for the section where the pigs slept. The feed, most of all, kept coming, and now that the pigs were full grown and the pasture was dead, there was nothing for them to forage. Every calorie they ate came out of a sack, and every sack came out of an envelope that was nearly empty. Eli sat at the kitchen table one night with his ledger and a sharpened pencil and made himself face the numbers honestly, the way he'd faced hard things before. The money from the metals was almost gone. His pension would cover the house and his own simple needs. but it would not cover feed for 100 hogs through 3 more months of winter. He had perhaps 5 weeks of feed money left. After that, nothing. He did not sleep well that night. The cruel arithmetic of the situation was this: the obvious solution was the one he could not bear. The pigs were full grown now, healthy and heavy, worth real money at market. Selling even half of them would solve everything, would buy feed for the rest, would put the farm back on solid ground, would prove Walt Pruitt both right and wrong at once. It was the sensible thing. It was what any farmer in the county would tell him to do without a second's hesitation. Pigs were livestock, not pets. That was the whole arrangement of a farm. But Eli looked out at the barn in the dark, where 100 animals he had pulled back from the edge were sleeping warm and safe, and he could not do the math that ended with a stock trailer at his gate. He had not sold his metals to save them, only to send them off to the same fate he'd bought them away from. He knew it didn't make sense. He knew Margaret herself might have shaken her head at him this time. But he had made them a promise without ever saying the words. And Eli Mercer did not break promises, spoken or not. He told June none of this. She had enough on her plate with school and the daily work, and he would not lay his troubles on a girl who'd given him so much already. But June was sharp, and she noticed things. She noticed the feed sacks dwindling. She noticed Eli measuring portions more carefully, stretching each bag a little further. She noticed the new lines of worry around his eyes. "We're running low, aren't we?" she said one afternoon, not really asking. "We'll manage," Eli said, which was what a man says when he doesn't know how he'll manage. The first real blow came from an unexpected direction. A man Eli didn't recognize drove up the lane in a clean truck and introduced himself as a buyer for a regional pork operation. He'd heard about the 100 head, he said. He was prepared to take the whole lot off Eli's hands today at a fair price. He named a figure that made June's eyes go wide. It was enough to erase every worry Eli had. More than enough. "They're not for sale," Eli said. The buyer blinked, certain he'd misunderstood. He explained, patiently, as if to a confused old man and Matt, that this was a generous offer, that winter feeding was a fool's game, that no one in his right mind kept 100 grown hogs through the cold for no reason. He left a card on the fence post. "When the feed runs out," he said, climbing back into his truck, "and it will, you call me. I'll still buy. Maybe not for as much." He drove off, and the card sat on the fence post, and Eli left it there, weighted down by a stone, like a thing he was refusing to look at directly. December arrived gray and bitter, and Eli's situation grew worse in the quiet, grinding way that real trouble usually does. Not in one disaster, but in 100 small ones. The propane heater ran constantly now, and propane was not cheap. A windstorm tore a section of the barn roof loose, and the repair ate 2 weeks of feed money in an afternoon. Scout, his old companion, came down with a cough that meant another visit from doctor. Sandoval and another bill. Eli paid it. He always paid it. But the envelope from Delaney's was empty now, truly empty, and he had started dipping into the thin reserve meant for his own winter. He cut his own expenses to the bone. He stopped buying coffee, the one small luxury he allowed himself. He ate simply, eggs from his hens, vegetables he'd canned, beans. He turned the heat in the house down so low he wore his coat indoors, so that the propane could go to the barn instead. He told himself he didn't mind. He'd lived hard before. But he was 72 now, not 25, and the cold got into his joints in a way it hadn't once. June saw it all and said nothing for a while, and then one evening she couldn't hold it in. "You're starving yourself to feed them," she said, her voice cracking. "This isn't right, Eli. You sold your metals, you spent everything, and now you're freezing in your own house. For pigs. Maybe Walt was right. Maybe you should sell some. Just enough." It was the closest thing to a betrayal he'd felt from her, and he knew she didn't mean it that way. She meant it out of love, out of fear for him. That made it harder, not easier. "I made them a promise," he said. "You can't promise things to pigs," June burst out. "They don't even know. You're going to lose the farm. You're going to get sick. And for what? Who's it even for? Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something he'd never told her, never told anyone. When I was overseas, he said slowly, there was a time things went bad, real bad, and I was hurt and stuck, and there was no good reason for anybody to come back for me. The smart move, the sensible move, was to leave me. I'd have understood it. He looked at his hands. A man came back anyway, carried me out, cost him more than he could afford. He didn't make the math work. He just came back. He met her eyes. He didn't make it home himself, June, later on. He spent everything he had, and then he spent the rest on me. June had gone very still. Those medals, Eli went on, they were partly his. And every day I had them sitting in a drawer, I knew I'd never done a single thing to deserve being the one who came home. 100 animals at a gate, with nobody coming back for them. His voice was steady. I came back for them. That's the whole of it. That's who it's for. June didn't argue anymore. She wiped her face with her sleeve and went back to work. And from then on, she stretched the feed as carefully as he did and never once mentioned the buyer's card on the fence post. But understanding didn't pay for feed. By the third week of December, Eli was down to a few sacks and a few dollars and no plan at all. The buyer's card stared at him every time he passed the fence. The sensible voice in his head, Walt's voice, the buyer's voice, even Margaret's gentle, imagined caution, grew louder every cold night. Christmas was 4 days away. Eli did the math one final time, by candlelight to save on the electric bill, and the math said what it had said all along. He could not do this. He had given everything he had, sold the proudest possession of his life, frozen and starved himself, and it was not enough. In 4 or 5 days, the feed would be gone, and 100 animals would be hungry, and he would have no choice left but the one he'd sworn he'd never make. He sat in the dark and, for the first time in many years, felt completely defeated. The last sack of feed scraped empty on the morning of December 23rd. Eli stood in the barn in the gray dawn, the empty bag in his hands, 100 hungry animals watching him with their bright, trusting eyes, and he felt something inside him break clean through. He had failed. Not from lack of trying. He had tried with everything he had and everything he'd ever owned. But failure all the same. Scout, still recovering from his cough, leaned weakly against Eli's leg. The old dog seemed to understand. Outside, the sky promised snow. Eli walked to the fence, picked up the buyer's card from under its stone, and held it in his cold, bare hand. The phone was inside, on the wall. All he had to do was make the call. He did not make the call right away. Instead, Eli walked back into the house, sat down at Margaret's kitchen table, and put his head in his hands. The card lay in front of him. The phone waited on the wall, and he let himself feel, fully, the weight of what he'd done. The foolishness of it, the medals gone, the savings gone, the long, cold months for nothing. He thought he heard Margaret's voice, scolding, just sad. You tried to carry too much, love. But underneath the defeat, something stubborn refused to lie down. He had not done the wrong thing. He knew that, even now, even broken, beaten, coming back for the helpless was never the wrong thing. It hadn't been wrong for the man who came back for him, and it wasn't wrong for him to come back for them. The world was simply hard, and sometimes doing right cost more than a person's had. He looked at the empty glass case on the mantel where the medals had once sat, and he understood with sudden clarity that he didn't regret it, not the medals, not any of it. If he had to choose again, knowing how it would end, he would raise his hand at that auction every single time. That was worth something, he thought. To know all the way down that you'd spent yourself on the right thing. He reached for the phone, not for the card, but to dial it. And then outside he heard the sound of trucks, many trucks. Eli went to the window. Coming up Route 9, slow and steady through the gathering snow, was a line of pickups, Walt Pruitt's battered Ford in the lead, then Carl Avery's, then Dr. Sandoval's, then more he recognized and some he didn't. They turned one by one into his lane, and every truck bed was loaded high with feed sacks. June was in the lead truck beside Walt, her face flushed with cold and triumph. She jumped down before it had fully stopped. I told everybody, she said breathlessly. I told them the whole story, about the man who came back, about all of it. And they came. Eli stood on his porch in the falling snow, the buyer's card forgotten in his hand, and could not find a single word. The trucks kept coming. By the time the lane was full, there were more than a dozen, and people were climbing out into the cold. Neighbors, strangers, faces from the feed store and the diner and the church he hadn't attended in years. They began unloading feed sacks and stacking them by the barn in a wall that grew higher with every passing minute. 40 sacks, 60, 100. More feed than Eli had bought all autumn, appearing in his yard in the space of an hour. He came down off the porch on unsteady legs. Walt Pruitt met him halfway, and the gruff old cattleman looked, for once in his life, almost sheepish. I gave you a hard time, Walt said. Said you couldn't save everything that's drowning. He looked at the wall of feed, at the barn full of healthy hogs, at the crowd of people working in the snow. Turns out you can save a fair bit if you're stubborn enough, and you've got enough fools willing to be stubborn alongside you. He stuck out his hand. I'd be one of the fools if you'll have me. Eli shook it, still unable to speak. June came up beside him, and the words spilled out of her in a rush. She'd done it the night before, she explained. She couldn't stand watching him freeze and starve himself any longer. Couldn't stand the thought of that buyer's truck at the gate. So she'd gone to her father's diner at the dinner rush and stood up on a chair and told the whole room the story. All of it. The auctions, the 100 piglets at the gate, the medals he'd sold, the man who'd come back for him overseas at the cost of his own life, the promise Eli had made without words. She'd told them about a 72-year-old man sitting in a cold, dark house, having given away the proudest thing he owned, freezing himself so 100 animals nobody else wanted could stay warm. And nobody laughed, June said. Nobody called you foolish. Dad started crying right there at the register, and then everybody just started figuring out what they could bring. Carl Avery stepped forward, his arms full of feed. Word went around the county overnight, Eli. The whole county. Folks have been calling since dawn. He set the sack down. You've been alone out here too long. You forgot something about us. We take care of our own, and you're ours, whether you like keeping to yourself or not, Doctor. Sandoval was there, waving off any mention of the bills he still owed her. Settled, she said firmly. Consider it settled. The owner of the feed store had come himself and announced he'd be selling Eli feed at his own cost from now through spring, and not a word of argument would be heard about it. A woman from the church had organized a schedule so that someone would bring a load of feed every week until the weather broke. Somebody had brought a new propane tank. Somebody else was already up on the barn roof, fixing the section the windstorm had torn loose, hammering away in the snow, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Eli stood in the middle of all of it, this swirl of generosity he had never asked for and could not have imagined, and felt the defeat of the morning melting away like the snow on the warm sacks. But the county wasn't finished with him yet, mister. Delaney, the consignment shop owner, came walking up the lane on foot, carrying a small wrapped package with great care. The crowd, somehow knowing, began to quiet. Ellie, Delaney said, when you sold me your medals back in the spring, I never put them out for sale. Couldn't bring myself to. Something about the way you looked when you set them on my counter. I knew there was a story I didn't have the whole of. He held out the package. When June told it last night, I understood, so I want you to have these back. The cost is covered. The whole town chipped, in this morning, more than enough, and there's plenty left over for feed besides. He pressed the package into Eli's hands. Eli unwrapped the faded handkerchief with fingers that had gone numb, not from the cold, and there they were. All 7 medals gleaming up at him, home. For a long moment Eli could not breathe. He thought of the man who'd carried him out. He thought of all of them, the ones who hadn't come home, and he felt, for the first time in 50 years, not the weight of the debt, but something lighter. Something that might have been forgiveness. He had spent the medals to come back for the helpless, and the medals had come back to him, as if the whole circle had finally somehow closed. I don't. Eli started, and his voice broke, and he simply stopped trying to talk. It was June who saved him. She tugged his sleeve and pointed toward the barn, where the hogs, hearing the commotion and smelling the feed, had set up a tremendous chorus of grunts and squeals. Pip, the runt who'd nearly died in November, had wriggled out under the bottom rail again and was trotting across the snowy yard straight toward Eli, tail going like a metronome, utterly unbothered by the dozen strangers and the falling snow and the gravity of the moment. The little pig reached Eli and flopped against his boots, demanding to be fed, and Eli Mercer laughed. He laughed the way he hadn't laughed in 4 long years, a big helpless laugh that came up from somewhere deep, and the whole county laughed with him. And then someone tore open a feed sack, and the work of feeding 100 grateful animals began, 24 pairs of hands where there had been only two. By the time the snow stopped that afternoon, the barn was warm, and the troughs were full, and the wall of feed sacks reached nearly to the eaves. Eli stood in the doorway with Scout leaning against one leg and Pip rooting at the other, the box of medals tucked safe in his coat, and watched his neighbors work and laugh in his yard. He had set out to save 100 small lives. He had not understood, until that snowy afternoon, that they had been busy saving his. Spring came green and soft to the hills around Harlem Crossing, and Eli's farm had never been so alive. The hogs, full-grown and healthy, rooted contentedly in a wide new pasture that a dozen neighbors had fenced over the long winter. June, who came every day still, was talking about studying to be a veterinarian. Walt Pruitt stopped by most mornings for coffee Eli could afford to buy again. The barn roof was sound, the farm was whole. On the mantel, the glass case held the 7 medals once more, polished and gleaming in the morning light. No longer hidden in a drawer, no longer a weight, but set out plain for anyone to see. Eli's granddaughter visited that weekend and asked finally what they were for. "Coming back," he said and smiled.